I'm Harvey Thompson, the oldest of Rule Thompson's family, the only boy, and grew up on a small farm in eastern Wisconsin.
Near Valders.
Near Valders, right.
What direction from Valders?
Southeast.
About a mile and a half?
Yeah.
He's going to have to, if you are saying something, it's going to be hard to hear you because the mic is on him. So he would need to make him say what you are asking. You see what I'm saying?
Okay. Well, give a little more detail.
Yeah.
Of where you grew up.
Well, it's a mile and a half east of Valders. It was on essentially an 80-acre farm. I liked to hunt as a kid, and we had to walk across 40 acres to get to the timber, and the timber then was not only ours, but several neighbors. There's a chunk of solid timber about 2 miles by 2 miles, so there was lots of room for a kid to hunt.
Tell about when you went over to Thomas Thompson's and about the mouse in the paper sack.
Oh, well, Thomas Thompson, it was Thomas Helly, bought the farm in the first place, and his son Thomas carried on, and his grandson, also another Thomas, was working next door, disking, plowing, something. And I was a little kid. Dad was out in the field too, and our farms backed up to each other. And Thomas always was pulling tricks on me. And so I went to the house and got a paper sack and tipped a fence post over that was laying on the ground. I knew there were mice under it. Picked up these baby mice and put them in the sack and took them down to Thomas, and he thought I had, like usual, had something to eat. And he reached in the sack and came out with a handful of mice. He didn't appreciate that too much. And he was one of that family that didn't live to be very old. And it was interesting, my grandfather had 11 kids, and his brother Thomas had 11 kids. But from his 11 kids, there was one grandchild, and he had cerebral palsy and died when he was 21. So that family was completely gone.
And the stained glass window in the church.
Yeah, the farm then got transferred to his kids, and finally there was one left. And when she passed away, she donated the money to Our Savior's Lutheran Church, and it went to put the glass stained glass wall on the side of the church. That's the whole farm is that wall.
And what was her name? Do you remember?
No, I don't. She was the youngest one in the family, and I don't remember her name.
Your mother was Esther
Harvey,
and her grandparents were the Sabos.
right.
And you grew up on the Sabo farm.
One of them, yes.
One of the Sabo farms.
Yes. Owned by her uncles.
Yeah. And she was raised by her uncles.
Yes, she was, her parents both died. So she and her two brothers were essentially orphans. Mom was 11, and the boys were probably 9 and 7 when these two uncles took these kids over to raise.
What do you remember about Grandma Albo, Anna?
Well, I remember that she lived in a house next to the cemetery in Ames. She used to come and stay at our place for a week or so every once in a while. And that's what happened when she died. She was in the house, and this was in the winter, March, I think. She was in the house and decided she'd go out to the barn where Dad was and see what he was doing. And she didn't come back, and Mom went to the barn to check on her, and she wasn't there. She hadn't been there. They finally checked in the outdoor plumbing, the two-holer, and she'd had a stroke. And my Uncle Roy was living with us that time.
That's your mom's brother.
My mom's brother. And he and Dad carried her in the house, and she lived for a few days and then passed away from that stroke.
You remember how old you were?
I was probably, that was 1926. I was probably 5 and a half.
We have a picture of you when you were just a little guy on her lap.
Sitting on the front porch.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was taken, I think that was taken right after we'd had a sleet storm. But it didn't get the sleet damaged trees, but it got Grandma and me sitting on the porch. One other thing about her, when the day or two before she died, she was knitting a pair of mittens for me. And she got those finished, and I went to the barn and was playing with the cats, I suppose, and took my mittens off and laid them down. And a calf got one and chewed the thing up. Well, Grandma said, I was all upset, a little kid. And Grandma said, well, I'll just replace it. I'll get a new one for you. But then she had that stroke, and she never finished it. And for years, we had a trunk upstairs that had a bunch of, well, I called it junk, but things that Mom or Dad wanted to save, and they were thrown in that trunk. And that one lone mitten stayed in that trunk for years.
Who did the mittens that we have? Or you used them as a liner for leather mittens?
Oh, the big wool mittens. Yeah. Well, that Aunt Clarina knit those, but her husband, Dan Kimball, raised the sheep, and he sheared the sheep, and Aunt Clarina made yarn out of
spun the yarn,
and then she knit the mittens, and I've got them yet.
Now you were born October 30th, 1920.
Right.
So at this point you're 91 and a half.
Yeah.
About.
Yep.
Your mother worked for Uncle George and Aunt what was her name? Emma.
Yeah, for one time she did.
Before she was married.
It was just a short duration, a few weeks.
Was that when your dad was in France?
I think that was while Dad was in the service, yeah.
And then your dad got home from service, and his dad, what was that story?
Well, he would never spoke to him. When Dad came back from France, and he was in bed, walked in his bedroom, the old man turned his back on him.
So his dad never spoke to him after he came back from France at all?
No. Well, he never, he and Dad were always crossways. And I used to tell Dad that his problem was he was so much like his dad that they couldn't get along with each other.
I don't think your dad was as mean as his
No,
dad was.
Dad wasn't
any
mean by any
I-
means, but
Actually, your dad was, he didn't want people to know it, but he was pretty soft-hearted.
he was
He put up a tough front, and he didn't want people to know that he was
a softy.
a softie. But we saw it many times,
Yeah,
which is a contrast.
that was a contrast to his dad. Yes,
Yes,
there's
and
no
his
question about
and
that.
his grandfather.
Well, he was always that way. They'd farm together in Montana,
No.
or rather North Dakota, and they were always crossways about something.
Those stories about his father's treatment are on some tapes and CDs that we have that he made. So I think that's already documented. Straight from his dad's memories.
Yeah,
So I don't think we need to go into that,
no,
and we need to share those,
yeah.
but not on this
Okay.
recording. But your dad was the youngest of the 11,
Right?
and he had several mothers.
Yes.
His older sisters.
Well, when he'd get into some devilment, if his mother wasn't around, one or two or three of his sisters would take over.
I don't know if the story about Thomas taking a whip to your dad,
Oh,
his
yes.
tapes.
I don't know if that's on one of his tapes, but what happened is Dad had, well, he didn't follow through and do something that Thomas told him to do. So he picked up a piece of harness and was giving him a paddling when my grandmother, his mother, came in, and she told him to quit, and he kept on. There was a buggy whip standing in the corner of the barn, and she picked that up and used it on Thomas, her oldest son. She said, "That kid's mine. You don't have anything to do with him."
If he needs discipline, she'd do it.
Yep.
Now you have a lot of problem with the basal cell carcinoma on your head, and I think you might talk about how this comes about. I think it's a common problem for a lot of your relatives.
Well, it's a matter of too much sunshine as a kid. I always went without a shirt in the summertime, and I always wore a baseball cap with the bill turned up so it didn't protect my forehead at all. And 60, 70, 80 years later, I paid for it.
And I think this is happening to several of your cousins.
Well, yes, and a lot of other kids.
Yeah,
Well, not kids.
they were kids,
They were kids.
and it's going to happen to some more.
It was interesting how I got to go to college. I wanted to go to college, and I was a 4-H kid, and but I didn't have any money when I finished high school. And one day, our county extension director, or we called them county agents, drove by and saw me in the yard and backed up and said, "I thought you were going to college." And I told him I wanted to, but I didn't have any money, so I couldn't go. And he said, "How about going to the farm short course?" And I said, "Well, I still don't have any money." He said, "You don't need money. I've got an NYA job," which was one of the federal, like WPA and all these things.
National Youth
National Youth Organization, I think. And he says, you can have the job. So I took it. So it sounded interesting. When I got to Madison, my job was pitching down silage from 4 silos that were used in a research project. And that wasn't, it wasn't so bad after I sent home and got an extra set of clothes to wear while I pitched down silage and didn't stink up the classroom.
But you probably still, because you didn't take a shower after you got out of the silo.
Anyway, it worked out all right. The next year,
That was a $100 scholarship, wasn't it?
well, it was amounted to $100, yeah.
Or a quarter?
No, it was the whole course. It was course lasted 15 weeks,
Okay.
and it was $96 for 15 weeks is what it was. And the next year, I didn't have any money, and Harvey Weaver still had the job down there, so I took it. And this time, I worked for the dean's secretary, and that was much better than pitching down silage out of those silos. And it still paid my tuition.
Another $100.
Another $100.
Did you live in the sheet barn the first year or the second year?
No, first year we lived in a World War I Army barracks. The second year was in a sheep barn that wasn't good enough for the sheep, so they made it into a place for the farm boys to stay while they were in school.
But then you went on to finish your PhD. What was, you started your freshman regular?
No, I went to Manitowoc to what they called University Extension that time, which was not the kind of extension that I was later. But went to University Extension in Manitowoc, where I got math and English and so forth, stuff that you have to have anyway. Then the next year, I still didn't have any money, but I had more guts. So I went to college and got jobs in Madison, got a job spotting pins in a bowling alley, and did that 5 nights a week and Sunday afternoon.
40 cents an hour?
Oh, it was so much a line. It got to be about 40 cents an hour. So I did that for a year. Then I went into service for 4 years and then came back and finished up.
You'd shown the kids your account book for that first year.
That first year when I spotted pins in a bowling alley was $4.15. Was room, board, tuition, the whole bit. And that was 1940, just before I went in service.
So 40 and 41. That was a full year. Fall of 40 to the spring of 41. And then you went into the service.
Yeah.
So then you finished your bachelor's, and master's, and PhD on GI Bill.
Yeah.
Did you live with Mrs. I all that time, Mrs. Eilenfeld?
No, that was about the last 2 years of graduate school. I stayed with her. Well, she and Roy, her husband.
Yeah.
And that was good. They were brought up around Two Rivers and taught school around the country for 20 years, and then he was working with the State Department of Public Instruction. He used to come down. We had 4 guys living in what had been made as a family room, and he'd come down and we'd get in an argument about education. And he was like a bull in a china shop, but we sure had a lot of fun those 2 years.
You would just bring things up to disagree with him and get him going.
Oh yes, and we knew what to do to get him going.
But you finished there, in December of 1950
Yep,
and started working at Iowa State.
December 1st, 1950.
And been there ever since.
No, I retired in 83.
And that's, yeah. But you worked in extension in Iowa.
For 32 years. I used to say that I'd driven every paved road in the state of Iowa. That was never quite true, but it was pretty darn close.
And that's where we met.
Not on the road.
No, but at Iowa State.
Yeah,
And we're still there. Back to the early years. During the summers, you worked at the pea canning factory.
worked in a pea canning factory when I was over with a thrashing crew until school started in the fall.
How much an hour?
37.5 cents an hour. And I remember one check that I got at 37.5 cents an hour. One check that I got was $52 for a week at 37.5 cents an hour. That meant I worked over 100 hours that week.
You didn't have time to spend it.
No, that was great. Besides that, the guys that I worked on the cooker, and the other guy and I, when we'd get the last crate of peas out of the cooker and into the cooling tank, then we'd just have to wait around. So instead of waiting around, we were the only two left on the place. We'd just strip and go for a swim in the cooling tank.
With the cans of peas.
No, we didn't eat any peas
So
that
I see
night.
you were in with the cans of peas.
Yeah,
And sometimes you'd break a can open for your midnight snack
yep.
and go home and sleep for a couple hours and be back on the job.
Well, get home and go to sleep. Around anywhere from midnight till 2 o'clock, and be back at work at 8 in the morning. But that was great because I couldn't spend anything, so that money was there when I went back to school in the fall.
And you didn't ever have any school loans.
No, that was unheard of at that time.
In high school, you were not very big when you started high school.
I was 5 feet and weighed 95 pounds.
Was it that year that you started to grow?
No, that was my sophomore year. I started out at about 5'3" and wound up about 5'9". And I had a pair of red corduroy or maroon corduroy pants that was new at the beginning of that year. Well, then they had to leave the cuffs down. Then they undid them entirely and left them down. So, and those darn things faded. Well, they were 3 different colors, the main pants, and then 2 circles down below that were a little different shade of red.
And you tried to play basketball, but Mrs. Phipps,
I did play basketball.
but didn't you have to quit?
She decided that it would be a good idea if I'd quit. In my mother's family, there was a lot of tuberculosis, and she thought that I was a candidate. So between her and my mother, they got me to quit basketball.
You were a skinny kid, which is no longer a problem.
Nope. No, everything I eat goes to pot.
Well, is there any of the other stories you want to talk about in connection with your uncles and aunts?
Well, not especially, but my mother's brother used to come and stay with us some winters, and he and I were always going around doing something. Well, one time I remember I'd gone to the basement to get an apple, or a couple apples, one for me and one for Roy, and came upstairs, and instead of handing it to him, I threw it at him, and he ducked and went out the window. And this was the night before Christmas, and that was
Broke the window.
oh well, and the storm. So that wasn't good around our place for me for a while. And one other time, we were cleaning the barn, hauling manure out and throwing it in the pile. And I was just a little kid then. And there was a box of salt sitting there, and we'd had snow the night before. And salt's white and snow's white, and I thought they'd mix pretty well, and I mixed them up and made a snowball. And Roy came along, and I threw this snowball at him. It hit him in the head and fell on the concrete floor and didn't even break. And he took after me, and I went out the door that went to the manure pile. And I got up on top of that, and he caught me. And then, like I said, there was 2 or 3 inches of new snow. Well, he washed my face in this snow, except he dug a little too deep. And I got washed with a mixture of white and brown. And I didn't appreciate that. My mother didn't either.
You didn't do it again.
No, I never did it again.
But who was it died? And no, it was Christmas Eve. It was Christmas Eve when you got sick and he stayed home with you?
No, that was Dad.
Oh, that was your dad.
He got sick, and the guy that stayed home with him was Guy Aubel, who was my grandmother's brother. And after the Civil War, he was a U.S. Marshal in the Dakota Territory, mostly trying to run down rum runners that were selling liquor to the Indians. And I sure wish that we could have gotten what you did with some people telling some of their experiences, because man, he could have had a bundle of them, I'm sure.
But your dad had gotten his pipe.
Well,
That's what made him sick.
Dad got his pipe when he'd gone out to the other room, and he took a few puffs of it, and he was only, I suppose, 6 or 7 years old that time. And he got good and sick, and Guy went out to the kitchen, and they skimmed their milk then, so they had good heavy cream. Got him to eat this cream, and then vomited and cured his problem.
But his folks never knew what he'd done.
No.
Well, maybe we've talked long enough at this point.
I think so.
Time to turn it over to someone else.
Turn it.
Okay. The skeeters are getting pretty thick.
They are.